To quote Thomas Jefferson, a well-informed citizenry is the best defense against tyranny. Welcome to the Constitution Solution, one podcast under God, where we discuss the basics of our constitutional republic and how our freedoms are being seized by public officials, both elected and unelected. I'm Mark DeLuzio, a former candidate for the U.S. Congress and a Gold Star father. Join me as we learn together how we can save this unique experiment that we call America. Hi, welcome to episode 51 of the Constitution Solution One podcast under God. Mark DeLuzio, back at you. This episode is called The General Welfare Clause and the Supreme Court, How the Government Owns You. Wow, Mark, you sound like a conspiracy theorist. I've actually turned into a conspiracy analyst. Simply because all my theories have come true. And so no longer am I theorizing about what's going on. I think I have enough at-bats and I've seen enough circuses and movies to be able to recognize corruption when I see it. And I have been skilled in my life as learning how to put all the big pieces together from a broader perspective to understand what's really happening to our country. Well, in this podcast, various episodes, I talk about all kinds of things: the Federal Reserve System, the military-industrial complex, the unconstitutional agencies that now fall under the executive branch. Therefore, those regulations allow the president to write law, how we have a lot of unchecked congressmen in Congress in general, ceding their powers over to the executive branch. And this one I'm going to talk about today is about the General Welfare Clause. The General Welfare Clause, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, has been abused and misinterpreted and expanded by the Supreme Court. And I'm going to take you through this. I'm going to first start by talking about the Founding Fathers, their vision, and what they look for a limited federal government. There's a very fine line between the states and the federal government. And the founders wanted to make sure that line was pure as possible, never going to be perfect. And they also wanted to make sure that the federal government didn't overreach into the states' rights. And that's what the 10th Amendment's all about. So let's talk about the General Welfare Clause first, as it sits in the Constitution. In the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. Now, Article 1 is dedicated to the legislative branch. Article 2 is the executive branch. That's the president. For those of you in Rio Linda, I love saying that. God bless Rush Limbaugh. Article 3 all talks about the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court and that whole branch of government. Now, the founders put a lot of time and effort into Article 1 because it represents over 50% of the words used in the original Constitution. I'm not talking about the amendments now, just the original Constitution was roughly 4,500 words. Half of those were all in Article 1. Okay. Now, Article 1, Section 8 talks about the enumerated powers of Congress. Those powers, there's 18 of them, those powers were enumerated to Congress to say, hey, you guys can write law around these 18 things. Okay. And one of those enumerated powers has to do with the power to lay and collect taxes. So let me read it. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide the common defense and general welfare of the United States. That's what's known as the General Welfare Clause. So now you say, well, Mark, what's the big deal? Okay. The General Welfare Clause is pretty clear. I mean, they're going to pay for basically anything that benefits us as Americans. No. The General Welfare Clause was meant to mean for the benefit of the nation as a whole, not any one individual, not any one corporation, not any one group, like a university, Planned Parenthood, um, go down the list, right, of how we spend our money. And certainly not for foreign aid, giving money to foreign countries. And by the way, one of my episodes earlier, we are still funding our arch enemies like China, communist countries. We're still giving foreign aid to these countries. A subject for another day, okay? Now, let's start out with the guys who wrote the Constitution and see what they had to say. And I'm going to go through some quotes also about what the founders had to say. There were concerns about an overreaching government, and remember, the Federalist Papers were written by primarily Madison, John Jay, and Hamilton. John Jay had a very small part of that, trying to convince the state of New York through editorials to their newspapers that the government wasn't going to be overreaching. It's kind of ironic now to think about the state of New York not wanting an overreaching government because that government has gone out of control in terms of taxes, spending, and all the other things that go on. But anyway, back then, that was a holdout, and if we didn't get New York, we would not have gotten the Constitution ratified. So the Federalist Papers are all about talking about the limited government that this Constitution was going to bring. So let's talk about Madison, who wrote the Constitution. Okay. He had a quote that said, "If Congress can do whatever in their discretion that can be done with money and will promote the general welfare, then the government is no longer a limited one." In a sense, he said, Article 1, Section 8 enumerated powers, you might as well just throw them out. Because Congress now, based on a very loose opinion interpretation of what constitutes general welfare, means they can spend money on anything they think would be a welfare to our nation or to an individual. Okay? And think about it. Why would they write Article 1, Section 8 dictating exactly what Congress could write laws about if they basically gave them an open checkbook to say, hey, you can write laws on anything you think is general welfare? Okay? Think about that. We're going to get to this in a minute when we talk about some of the court cases. Okay? Now, Hamilton was a big government guy. He and Jefferson, in particular, in Madison, they all fought with Hamilton. He advocated for a central bank. He would, advocated for what we have now, the Federal Reserve, which is a central bank. Jefferson was against the central bank. So he was more of a big government guy. He wanted more control. Okay. But he viewed that you could tax and spend anything on the national interests of the country. Now, I don't know if Hamilton really thought that you can spend money on an individual. And again, I'll give some examples in a few minutes about how this went down. Jefferson's position was exactly like Madison's. And he wrote about the concern he had over a broad use of general welfare. Matter of fact, I think he actually was against even using the term because it might have been misinterpreted as time went on. So they had issues, both Jefferson and Hamilton. Okay, so let's just look at some quotes by the founding fathers. And why are these quotes important? Because if you're a strict constitutionalist like Judge Scalia was, boy, do we miss him. He went back in time. He didn't say, hey, well, this is a living document and this document has to change with the times and all that, like a lot of judges do now. Okay. He said, no. Those principles still hold 250 years ago. Okay. Those principles still hold. And he was he strictly interpreted the Constitution. Matter of fact, so much so that he voted against flag burning. Okay. In other words, he voted for that to be a First Amendment right to burn the flag. Took a lot of flack for that. But if you really understand the founder's vision of the First Amendment and freedom of speech, he was right on the money. and his, and again, he took a lot of heat for that. How could you vote to burn the flag? Well, if he said if you can vote to if you can burn the flag and make that illegal, okay, what else can you do? What else can you do? I mean, think about it. You open the Pandora's box once you violate the Constitution because of something you like or something you don't like. Okay, so he was right on the money on that, in my opinion. Okay, so the founding fathers, and I'm going to talk about some quotes here about charity because this ties in to this whole notion of the general welfare clause. Medicine. Charity is no part of the legislative duty of the government, quote unquote. Okay? He opposed using federal funds for charitable purposes. Thomas Jefferson. To compel a man to furnish contributions of money in this regard is sinful and tyrannical. To compel a man. He viewed charity as a personal, moral, not a government responsibility, a moral obligation. Okay. And by the way, he was not against charity. He was just against the federal government using our taxpayer money for charity. A lot of different reasons. One is you just invited a whole framework of corruption or possibility of corruption when you did this, right? And as you see, a lot of the monies that are being spent right now today, and they have been spent for quite some time, are used to garner votes. Hey, I'm going to bring in $50 million for that bridge in my district. Well, that's a state road. That's a state bridge. Why are we using federal funds for? Well, because I've got to get elected, and I got to bring back the bacon. I got to bring back the money. Okay, that's what's important now, right? Not abiding by the federal constitution, and also not being good stewards of taxpayer dollars. It's more important. I'll spend this money now to get elected. Benjamin Franklin. He, again, all these founders advocated for charitable giving and thought it was a moral obligation, but not by the federal government. He advocated self reliance and civic engagement through voluntary aid. And you think about healthcare. Why are so many hospitals named after, St. Francis Hospital, St. Mary's, St. Jude's? Because the churches were the ones that provided health care before we got into this welfare state, okay, and the government taking over health care. It was handled. It was handled, okay? John Adams. The moment the idea is admitted, being charity, anarchy and tyranny commence. How's that one for you? George Washington. He framed it as a personal, moral responsibility to be charitable, not a government responsibility. Noah Webster. The most important service rendered is to train men to think for themselves. How's that grab you? To be self reliant, to be self sufficient. Does that sound familiar? Does that not sound like a conservative platform? Okay. He promoted charity through education and religious institutions, not from the federal government. Okay. They saw charity as a personal virtue and they rejected federal involvement in charitable spending. Okay. They strongly supported private and religious charity. All of them did. Okay. And the bottom line is charity was unconstitutional. Spending federal money for any kind of charity was unconstitutional. So I thought I'd lay that in here because the charity quotes that these guys had do tie back into how we spend our money today. Okay. And I want you to remember that when the government takes from you and gives it to somebody else, the government owns you both. Think about that. Let's talk about the Supreme Court because this is where this all went haywire in the 1930s. There were several court cases that came up: U.S. versus Butler, Helverine versus Davis, South Dakota versus Dole in 1987, and then there was the Obamacare Affordable, I love the name, Affordable Care Act that raised everybody's premiums. Uh, so, uh, but I'm going to talk about two of them. Okay, the two that I thought were one really is a landmark case. That's in 1937, Helverine versus Davis. Okay, it talked about the constitutionality of the Social Security Act passed by the left's darling FDR. Okay, and uh, and and it challenged the Social Security Act of 1935, part of the New Deal, which I look back now and say, oh, that was a raw deal. It was a raw deal. This got passed by a majority. This got overturned. This challenge got overturned, again, challenging the Social Security Act of 1935 by a 7-2 majority in the Supreme Court. Okay. So the legal questions were: does the Social Security Act violate the 10th Amendment? Okay. So again, does Congress have the authority under the General Welfare Clause to enact such a program? Now let's go back to what I just said about charity. Let's think about what Social Security is, right? The way it's administered, you don't have your own account. You're not providing for yourself. It is social welfare. Okay. Personally, I have spent tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars into the program because I'm self employed. I have to play both sides of the equation on the Social Security tax and Medicare. Okay. Which amounts to roughly 15% of my income. And that's not federal tax. And that money is not sitting in a bank account that says Mark DeLuzio. Okay. I am 68 years old. I am paying $700 a month for Medicare still. And I'm not collecting Social Security because they say I'd make too much money. This is a social, the name is right. Social Security. They got half the name right. Social. Security? No. Nobody is retiring on Social Security. Okay. It's a joke. That's been the biggest Ponzi scheme and the biggest financial ripoff. And it makes Enron look like a dime store robbery. If a company ever did what the federal government did to that program, okay, people will be in jail for 3 lifetimes. All right. So this is not, hey, Mark, put some money away for your retirement and it's going to accumulate. We're going to invest it somehow. And that pot of money will be sitting for you waiting when you retire. It's not what this is at all. Okay. This is a way to spread wealth. This is a socialistic program. Okay. So, like I said, they got the first word right: social security, but there's no security. So, the question here was: does the Social Security Act violate the 10th Amendment? And does Congress have the authority under the General Welfare Clause? Well, the Supreme Court came down and said, yes, they do. They have a right. It doesn't violate the 10th Amendment. They have a right under the General Welfare Clause to write such legislation. Okay. They looked at the General Welfare Clause as an independent power, not limited to the enumerated powers. The ironic part about that is the General Welfare Clause is an enumerated power. Okay. But they looked at it separate from the other 18 powers that they could tax now and spend money on Social Security, which is what they're doing. Okay. You go back to Madison, who wrote the Constitution, and the other founders, they would vehemently disagree with this. But this is where the court came down. Okay. They also said Congress has broad discretion in determining what constitutes general welfare. Now, remember what I said. the founder's vision of that clause, and again, Jefferson had a big problem with it, and he was worried about that clause, and he wrote about it, was to spend money for the welfare of this general welfare, general, keyword, of the nation. So they could spend money for supporting an army, for example, or fighting a war. That's a general benefit of the nation, okay? They can't tax us and take money from Mark DeLuzio and give it to John Smith. But that's exactly what's going on now, okay? There was a dissenting opinion by Justice James McReynolds. He argued that social welfare is a state matter and not a federal matter, and it's unconstitutional. So, again, this goes back to that fine line the founders try to create between the states and the federal government has now been obliterated because of this ruling in 1937. I think this ruling, in and of itself, was the key ruling. There's some others as well that I'm not going to talk about today. This is probably the key ruling. This is way back in 1937. Okay. That opened up the kimono, if you will, and the floodgates for all kinds of federal spending on all kinds of uh, 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 programs that Congress deemed general welfare. Okay, and remember, Congress wants to get elected every 2 years. So, in order to do that, they're going to promise money. When I ran for Congress up in Arizona, the Navajo Nation was one of my constituents, and all they wanted to know is how much money are you going to get us? What are you going to bring to us? Right? That's all they wanted to know. And without regard for whether or not it was constitutional, okay? How much money are you going to bring to us? Because the Democrat guy said he's going to bring all kinds of money to our reservation. Okay, that's what's going on here. Okay, so this floodgate that got open did lead its way to Obamacare, which was another court case, by the way, that got adjudicated in favor of Obamacare. Thank you, Justice Roberts, for that. But this led to Obamacare. Hey, if we can have a Social Security program for retirement, why not Obamacare? And it also led to Medicare and Medicaid. Okay. So you see now the welfare state, now the socialistic state that the founders didn't want, there was nothing in the Constitution that talked about education, that talked about healthcare, that talked about retirement. Okay. Nothing. But they took this general welfare clause and interpreted it as such that there's an open checkbook now. Okay. Now, let me give you another court case. This is just another example, probably not as significant as this one that is talked about. It was called South Dakota versus Dole, 1987. It was a majority opinion, and the majority opinion was by Justice William Rehnquist. Okay. Congress passed a law requiring the Secretary of Transportation to withhold 5% of federal highway funds from states that did not raise the drinking age to 21. At the time, South Dakota the drinking age was 19. It went to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that it was legal for the Department of Transportation to withhold 5% from states if they did not do what they said in this regard. Okay. So tell me that doesn't violate that fine line between federal and state rights. Now the argument was, hey, by raising the drinking age to 21, there'll be less accidents. Younger drivers tend to get into more accidents. It's a safety thing. It is for the general welfare. of the nation, and that's how they interpreted this. The crazy thing about this is how the federal government uses our taxpayer money to have their way with us. So our rights as a state are taken away by dangling money, our money that we gave them to begin with, in front of them, saying, if you don't do this, you're not getting this. Hey, come on. In all due respect, President Trump's doing the same thing with states with women in sports, right? I don't like he's doing it. Most of the stuff he's doing, I love. I like what he's doing. I don't like the fact that we're using federal money to extort and get our way with these states. Okay. And you got to remember, these states were set up to be almost as independent nations where, hey, you don't like the abortion laws in one state or the transgender laws in another state or the drinking laws or the drinking age in another state, you can pick up and move. Okay. That's how this was set up. But to have that kind of federal control over the states, not allowing the people to make their own decision, in this case, on drinking age, is just plain unconstitutional. I don't know how else you say it. I mean, I'm a pretty simple guy, and when I look at this, I don't like the fact that we can blackmail or we could extort uh, behavior by holding back federal funds, regardless of whether or not I like this. By the way, I have a huge disdain for men playing in women's sports for a lot of different reasons. Okay, that's not the issue. The issue is once you allow an infringement like that for something you like, I can guarantee you there'll be something down the road that will have the same characteristics of abuse on something you don't like. Okay. So that is my problem with this whole notion of holding back rules. Now, out of this court case, and why I brought this one up was there came a 4-part, what they call the Rehnquist rule or the Rehnquist 4-part test. Now, remember, Rehnquist was the judge that wrote the majority opinion. He said that this general welfare spending, has to meet 4 criteria. 1, the spending must promote the general welfare. Well, good luck with that. I mean, that is so loosely. There's no guidelines around that requirement. Okay, so I could say, hey, I need to save the dart snail out in Oklahoma. I don't know, and maybe somehow tie it into general welfare or something. 2, the condition must be unambiguous. Okay. A lot of this is not ambiguous because it's very specific as to what we're going to spend the money on. 3, the condition must relate to the federal interest in the program. Federal interest in the program. What does that even mean? Okay. There's no criteria around this. And 4, the condition must not violate any other constitutional provisions. Okay. What about the general welfare clause? Okay. I mean, you see what I'm getting at? I mean, these 4 principles or these 4 rules are so general and vague. It basically opened up the checkbook for Congress to spend money on anything they damn want. Okay. On anything. So you can argue Article 1, Section 8 goes away. Okay. Because they can now write and spend money. Remember, Congress is where the budget and money gets spent. They have the power of the purse. Okay. Of course, the Senate has to obviously vote on and pass the bill as well. But all spending bills start in the House of Representatives. That's the Congress, right? And they have what we call the power of the purse. Okay. And there's all kinds of other ways that power of the purse is violated. I talked about emergency spending with Paul Gosar, congressman from Arizona. That was an earlier episode, and a bunch of other ways that the president now can spend money without congressional approval. But anyway, these requirements are so loose that you might as well not even have them. Okay. So the bottom line on all of this is it gave the ability of the federal government to shape state policy using funding as the weapon of choice. Okay. When I was running for Congress, I had a lady ask me, I was talking about the Department of Education and how that's a non-constitutional agency, how it should be obliterated. And all these presidents in the past said they're going to get rid of that agency, and they never did, except for President Trump. Here he comes along, and hopefully he sees it through. I happen to know Linda McMahon personally, and she's a tough cookie. Okay, and hopefully this agency is going to go away. It is a unbelievable waste of money and also a big infringement on state rights. Okay, but again, with the Rehnquist rule, you can look at that and say, well, general welfare, education. Who's going to argue against education? That's apple pie and motherhood, right? I mean, who's going to argue against it? And this is how all these towns justify these big education budgets. I mean, Glastonbury, Connecticut, where I used to live, 70% of the town's budget is education. And there's just nothing too good for our kids. Okay. Nothing too good for our kids. Every dollar we spent is going to be for the benefit of our kids. So the whole notion of being frugal, uh, the whole notion of being conservative with our money. No, you cut a dollar out, our education scores are going to go down because of you, right? So no, that's crazy. But anyway, this lady came up to me and she said, "Mark, you want to get rid of the Department of Education?" And I work in education. Where are we going to get the money from? And I looked at her and I said, "Well, can I ask you a question? Where do you think the Department of Education gets their money?" And she just looked at me. I haven't thought about it that way. Yeah, okay. And let's go on, I said, and talk about for every dollar you give them, you might get back 50 cents on the dollar if you behave, if you do what they say they want you to do, whether it's critical race theory, DEI, No Child Left Behind, whatever cockamamie many program they come up with. If you behave, you get 50% of your money back. Okay. Once you want that, I told her, I said, once you want the money to stay here in Arizona, in your own community, where you guys can use that money as you see fit. I never thought about. Thank you very much for that answer. See, people don't get it. They don't understand because this was a younger woman who, you remember the Department of Education was 1972 by Carter, I think, somewhere around there. So she lived in a world where that department always existed. Okay. And never even thought for 1 minute that it was unconstitutional or that program, that department should never have been to begin with. Okay. But I want to go back to the Marxist Communist Manifesto. I know you sound like a black helicopter conspiracy theorist. One of the 10 tenets of the Communist Manifesto, and I have an episode on that, is to control education. Okay. I'll leave you with that as far as that subject goes. So, to reiterate some of the criticisms on all these rulings and where we stand today, okay, the General Welfare Clause is very vague. Now, you basically can spend money on anything. Like I said earlier, it basically takes Article 1, Section 8 and gives Congress an open checkbook to spend money on anything. How do you think we got to Planned Parenthood? We were spending, I think, $500 million a year on them. Okay. How do you think we got to funding all these universities? And some people say, well, you're funding research for these universities, and that's in the general interest of the country, along the lines of the General Welfare Clause. Maybe so, except there's never any accountability what happens to that money, and most of it goes to climate change. Okay, and they still say with the trillions that got spent on climate change, we're all going to die in 10 years anyway. Okay, so there's never any accountability for the money that we give these schools. And oh yeah, by the way, you ever notice if you did a little bit of math and find out how many kids of legislators go to these Ivy League and elite schools? They can't all be that brilliant. Believe me, I know many of them out there, and they're not brilliant. I know their kids aren't brilliant. Okay. But somehow, Chelsea Clinton ended up in Stanford. And their first job was $600,000 at Maine. Okay. Uh, all these kids going to these schools on both sides of the aisle, by the way. So now I got a little. This is the corruption that Jefferson talked about. You want to call that charity to these schools? Fine. I mean, they got billions of dollars of endowment funds. Why are we giving them money? Okay. Well, there's a quid pro quo here. All right, and this money, money corrupts. Right? The founders knew that. That's why they had the checks and balances between the three branches. Okay. So, very vague general welfare clause, erosion of our 10th Amendment rights, because the states now, their rights are being trampled upon by the federal government, not only in this way, but in many other ways. Okay. The federal government is mandating through grants and all kinds of other funding, in other words, giving back our money to ourselves, to mandate state compliance on whatever social program or little program that's trying to enact. Fiscal discipline is gone. Okay, and I need to get elected. So yeah, I think we should. I'm going to campaign on reducing the federal budget, but not my district. Okay, and it's kind of tough if so many people today who are on government assistance, and a politician goes out and says, "Hey, I'm going to cut the cost of government." The first thing they think about is their benefits are going to be cut. I ain't voting for that guy. No way. I'm not voting for him. Okay, or her. It's a tough game. Okay. So now we've opened up the meaning of the welfare clause, and we are basically anything's game. And I'll leave you with a couple other thoughts here, and I want to tie this into the Federal Reserve. But let's end with a quote by Thomas Jefferson. He said, "I would reduce the whole instrument to a single phrase, that of instituting a Congress with power to do whatever would be for the good of the United States, and as they would be the sole judges of the good or evil, it would be also a power to do whatever evil they please." If you ever studied Thomas Jefferson, the wisdom this guy had was off the charts. Off the charts. He knew the nature of man. And everything he predicted, from the Federal Reserve, central banks, to this, to other areas of our infringements on the original intent of the Constitution, he called for way back when. Okay, 250 years ago. The guy was brilliant. The guy was absolutely brilliant. Okay. So not only does overspending, hey, look, I need votes, I need power, I need to get reelected, I need to make sure I get bennies from my district. But this ties now into the size of government. And as you know, it's been growing and growing and growing. And with the passing of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and doing away with the gold standard, thank you, Richard Nixon, amongst others, we now have an out of control economy where Congress no longer has the power of the purse. The Federal Reserve controls the economy. And I talked a lot about this. I'm probably going to do some more episodes on this because the Federal Reserve's a little bit tough for your average person to understand. And I'm going to try to break it down in the more simplest terms. If you ever think about how, if you go back to the 1970s, let's say, if you're that old, why did things cost so much less then, and why are they so expensive today? Because when the Federal Reserve creates money into existence out of nothing but a couple computer strokes on a computer and adds $2 trillion to the money supply, the money is now devalued. That's called inflation. Your money is worth less. Remember, the fundamental concept, more of anything means it's going to be worth less. I don't care if it's baseball cards. If there's one Mickey Mantle baseball card or a million, guess what? That one, if there's only one in existence, you know it's going to be worth, right? My grandson at 10 years old said, "Oh, Poppy, that would be worth gazillions of dollars." Okay. Um, Tomatoes, houses, automobiles. The more of anything, it's worth less. The same concept applies to money in your bank account. So if the Federal Reserve prints money and inflation goes to 10% in one given year, like it did with Biden, and you have $10,000 on January 1st, by the end of the year, your bank account, forget interest for a minute, your bank account's still going to say $10,000. But you're only going to be able to buy $9,000 worth of goods. That's the worst and cruelest tax ever, because that $10,000 that's in your bank account most likely has already been taxed. And now you're paying a hidden tax through inflation. So this overspending promulgated by the General Welfare Clause inflates our federal spending. And then you say, okay, well, where are we going to get the money? We being the federal government can't get it all from taxes. We've been running a budget deficit every year for how long? So we need to print money and get it from the Federal Reserve. So what they do is they print money, create it out of nothing, create it into existence, and then buy our debt through treasury bills. And then we spend that money, and we got to pay that money in interest back to the Federal Reserve. Okay? What a great business that is. Wouldn't you like to have a business like that where you can sit down at your computer and just create money and then loan it out and get paid not only principal but interest back later? What do you care if the money's deflated? It's money you never had to begin with. So those guys are making out like bandits at the Federal Reserve. Okay? So that's what's going on. So this general welfare clause was a key component to inflating our federal government, in addition to violating all of our rights at the state level, okay, and violating our personal property rights by overtaxation, right? So this whole debt, this whole inflationary movement is something that the founding fathers studied, and which is why they put the checks and balances in, okay, and made us a representative government. They did all the right things, but we are undoing these things one at a time, giving the executive branch more power than they should have. I talked about tariffs. That's in Article 1, Section 8. It's a congressional responsibility, not a president's responsibility. The ability to go to war has to be declared by Congress. We haven't declared a war. Of all the wars we fought since World War II, none have been declared, okay, except for the Gulf War. And the Afghan War, which lasted for over 20 years, only was approved to go after the terrorists for 9/11, not to be there for 20 years and fight the Taliban. Okay. Um, so that's being violated. So all these things are being violated. And sooner or later, our country is going to have an economic collapse like they did in Greece, in Rome with the Roman Empire, and a lot of other nations around the world. Okay. So that's the importance of the general welfare clause, is a root cause reason why our government and our economy is out of control. Right. So I'll leave you once again with this. I don't know if it's a quote, it's a saying, it's my saying. Whenever the government takes from you and gives to somebody else, the government owns you both. Think about that. Hope this was helpful. Write your congressman. We need to get back in front of the Supreme Court and start challenging some of these things. Right now is the right time to do it because of the composition of the court. Okay. Although some of these constitutional jurists I'm a little worried about, but you never know what's going to happen. So, anyway, I'll leave you with that. Episode 51, the General Welfare Clause and the Supreme Court, how the government owns you. Hope this was helpful, and we'll see you guys next time. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the Constitution Solution, one podcast under God. The Constitution is the solution to most of our country's problems. Other episodes can be found on our website at 1787solution.com, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and most other podcast platforms. I'm your host, Mark DeLuzio. Until next time, may God bless you, may God bless America, and may America bless God.